Anzi, I love it. He's trying.
Hello and welcome to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter LaBelle. Hugo Chavez, a maniacal dictator or a truly popular and democratic leader of the people? What is his legacy? Did he leave Venezuela and his people better off? Why did Washington demonize him so? And will the Chavez revolution outlive its founder? To crosstalk the Chavez legacy, I'm joined by George Chukarillo-Marr in Philadelphia. He's an assistant professor of political science at Drexel University and author of the upcoming book, We Created Chavez. In London, we have Alec Boyd. He is a Venezuelan blogger and civil and political rights activist. And in Washington, we cross to Alex Main. He is an international policy analyst at the Center for Economic and Policy Research. All right, gentlemen, crosstalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want, and I very much encourage it. George, what is Chavez's legacy?
Well, I think, frankly, Chavez's legacy is twofold, domestically speaking. The first is the vast improvement in the social welfare of everyday Venezuelans, the massive decline in poverty, the near eradication of extreme poverty, and the provision of free healthcare, free education to the poorest Venezuelans for the first time. On the political side, which I actually think is more important, the legacy is one of increased popular participation and direct and participatory democracy in the everyday runnings of the state. And this was something that is far from complete in Venezuela, and it remains a task of the forthcoming government. But it's really this element of the Chavez legacy which has allowed Venezuelans to participate and engage in political life in that country that is really going to outlive Chavez himself.
Okay, Alec in London, you wanted to jump in? That's the point of the program. Go ahead.
Yeah, I would love to. I think George has made a quite interesting remark when he says that Chavez, for the first time, provided health and education for the poor people, when in fact our Constitution mandates the provision of health and education for everybody since at least 1871. So perhaps George would like to explain to our viewers why does he say that Chavez, for the first time, provided such services to the poor?
Okay, George, go ahead.
Well, Alec, you know perfectly well.
I believe he's a professor,
that,
so he should
that a
know
constitution
this.
is one thing and the actual concrete provision. Yes, of course I do. And the concrete provision of things in reality is very different from what's written in the Constitution. And so you know perfectly well that 60% of Venezuelans were in poverty, up to very extraordinarily extreme poverty, even in the 1970s and 1980s. That neoliberal reform was a devastating impact on the health and education of the poorest Venezuelans. And so it's slightly ridiculous to say that there was free health care and universal access to health care since 1871.
There's always been free and health care and education in Venezuela. This is not a right with Chavez.
Okay, I want Alex to jump in. Okay, we have to hear from him. Go ahead, Alex.
Yeah, I mean, I can just compliment what George has said, which is that, yeah, absolutely, you have constitutional provisions, which are one thing, and then you have the reality, which is another. And the reality is that when Chavez came into power, you had a great number of poor people, millions of poor people in the country who were essentially disenfranchised, second-rate citizens, really. So not only were they not receiving health care or access to higher education, but also many of them didn't vote. They didn't participate in the political system. They weren't true citizens.
I would like to jump in there,
and,
Peter.
Under Chavez, this is
okay. Alec, jump in because you're the odd man. You're the odd man out. Go ahead.
I don't think that's born in the facts. Actually, Chavez did do a great deal for the poor. But to state that for the first time he allowed the poor to receive health and education is totally inaccurate. And that's the point that I'm trying to make. He did carry out a great deal of poverty alleviation measures with Barrio Adentro. He did spread a hell of a lot of money because of the fact of the greatest income that the country received since he got to power in 1999, but to actually state that because of him, the poor, for the first time in our history, have access to education and health is
what accounts for
totally
it then?
inaccurate.
What accounts for it then, George? I mean, other than Chavez?
Well, I mean, the point is not that it's only Chavez that has done this, and actually, I would hope to drive that point home. It's not that Chavez is sort of the savior of the Venezuelan people. No, the Venezuelan people have saved themselves. For decades, they've been organizing and beginning with the guerrilla struggle and generating a whole series of social movements in the 1970s and 80s. It was actually these movements that then drove Chavez to power. So this is really not about Chavez himself coming into power and saving the people, because this constitution, the 1999 constitution, was not written by Chavez himself, was not the sole creation of Chavez the individual.
Well, it was written by his
instead
representatives.
the embodiment
as a matter of fact,
of the historic demands of
124
the
of
poorest Venezuelans.
129 of the representatives in the constituent Constituent Assembly were representatives of Chavez or aligned with Chavez. So it was largely, basically written by his supporters.
Okay, Alex?
Oh, yeah, right. I forgot that.
They were elected by the people. They were elected in popular elections by the people.
Alex, jump in. Go ahead.
Yes.
No, well, absolutely, that's right. I mean, whether they were aligned with Chavez or not, I don't think is the point. These were democratic elections that elected all of the assembly members, the Constituent Assembly. And they had a mandate of the people, and they reported back to the people. And there was a period of consultation of all sorts of sectors of society when that constitution was being drafted. I think something quite unprecedented in the region, probably in the world, in terms of drafting constitutions. And then that constitution was submitted to a popular referendum, something that's also very rare in the history of the world, in constitutional history. So I think, often you read in the media that, Chavez created this constitution, that he forced this constitution on the Venezuelan people, and nothing could be further from the truth.
Okay. Alec? Sounds like he was a Democrat.
I think it. Well. there's a few issues here. No one can deny that Chavez won democratic elections in 1998 on the back of huge discontent in our country about the duopoly of Acción Democrática and COPEI for the previous 40 years, who had basically squandered a hell of a lot of money. But then Chavez came on 1998 with the promise of reforming, refounding the state. That was not established in any of our legislation, in any of our constitutional precepts. So he said, basically, or he came to with the promise that in order for him to carry out the changes that he needed, he had to change the constitution, which effectively ended up with the National Constituent Assembly and the further referendum that Alex was referring to. So that first election of his in 1998 was indeed democratic. And it was indeed approved by the people on the back of the huge support that he had at one time. But the changes that came afterwards are far from democratic, in my opinion.
George? I mean, does it really...
Well...
okay, Alex, go ahead.
One thing is
Alex,
to say that you disagree. One thing is to...
Go ahead, Alex, go ahead.
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't really know what Alec is talking about in terms of the decline of democracy following those elections in 1998, and then the following elections in which the Constitution was approved in 1999, when you've had altogether 14 elections that have been judged free and fair internationally and transparent. The last, of course, was last year in November and December, both presidential and regional elections. Okay, please explain.
That is nonsense. They have been judged free and fair by whom? By Jimmy Carter? By Chavez's friends?
By the Carter.
When was the last time that the Smartmatic machines? When was the last time that the Smartmatic machines were independently audited? When was the last time that our national electoral roll was independently audited?
Have you ever seen the Carter Center's professionalism in terms of and neutrality in terms of electoral monitoring contested?
I have seen the professionalism of the Carter Center. As a matter of fact, I remember very clearly
perhaps by some of the Venezuelan opposition,
after the referendum in 2004, when Jimmy Carter was sitting next to Secretary General of the OAS, Cesar Gaviria, assuring all of us in Venezuela that they had witnessed the count in the totalization room at the CNE, when as a matter of fact, no one was allowed into the totalization room of the CNE. So Jimmy Carter was obviously lying that day, and his subsequent reports were obviously useless.
And
I see in the Organization of American States.
As a matter of fact, the Carter Center did provide in their report a number of recommendations.
Gentlemen, you're talking over each other. George, go ahead. George, go ahead.
I was just going to say what we're witnessing here is a profoundly conspiratorial fringe of the Venezuelan right wing that does not even actually pertain to much of the Venezuelan opposition officially. The Venezuelan opposition, especially since 2006, has recognized and has accepted the results of these elections.
And a member of the Academics for Chavez in America. Is that what you're trying to say, George? That my view is not valid because I am a right-wing conspiracy theorist?
I'm saying your view is not valid because it's
I would agree with
your view
George.
is not valid because it's ridiculous.
Yeah.
Everyone.
Of course you will agree, Alex. Of course you will agree. You are a former propagandist of the Venezuelan government. Of course you will agree.
All right.
And so will George.
Well then, but not only would I agree, but curiously, the Venezuelan opposition also agrees. They've been participating in the last few elections, encouraging everyone to participate, and discounting claims of fraud. That's come from the Capriles campaign itself. How do you explain that, Alec?
Okay.
I don't have to explain.
You can disagree with the contents of the Constitution.
Unlike you, Alex, I am completely independent, so I don't have to toe anyone's line. I am a Venezuelan blogger, and I am independent. And I don't derive my salary either from the Venezuelan government, as you once did, or from CEPR, which is closely aligned with the Venezuelan government. So I am the master of my opinions. And I don't have to toe the line of Enrique Capriles. Whatever he said with regard to fraud being there in Venezuela or not, I don't have to agree with. Actually, I disagree.
I'm sorry,
gentlemen, I'm going to jump in here. We have to go to a break. And after that short break, we'll continue our discussion on Hugo Chavez. Stay with RT.
I love it. Anytime.
Victims multiply here each day.
It's very profitable to invest in Colombia. Very profitable. There's a very high return on investment. I've been working in this area for 30 years, and I've always had to pay the armed groups. The paramilitaries have changed their name and strategy, but they're still the same murderers.
High-ranking suspects give no comment.
What do you have to say about that, Mr. President? Mr. President? I won't give an interview. I'm sorry. But no.
Investigation is a dead end.
It says, stop your bullshit and keep quiet or else you'll suffer the consequences. And tell your bodyguards to watch themselves too, because the same goes for them.
Blood rivers for gold's sake.
I've never heard of such a case as ours where so much money and gold has been stolen for so many years.
For all the gold in Colombia on RT.
I love it. Anytime.
Welcome back to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. To remind you, we're discussing the legacy of Chavez. George, why did the United States so demonize Chavez? I mean, well, explain it. He was a funny guy. There was a lot of antics there, but he didn't threaten the United States.
Well, that's actually an interesting phenomenon, both domestically within Venezuela and also internationally, namely the fact that before Chavez had actually even done anything to powerfully antagonize the Venezuelan elites, before he had taken away economic power, for example, there was a fierce counter-revolution without a revolution, as it's been called. And this happened as well internationally, namely the fact that Chavez had not cut off oil to the United States. He had not threatened U.S. interest in any particularly sharp way. Actually, we can mark the deterioration of relations with Chavez, especially from September 11th and the beginning of the Afghan war, after which Chavez was critical of the initial U.S. intervention and innocent children who were being killed. And it was really from that moment on that you saw an increasing aggression from the United States towards Chavez, culminating, of course, with his overthrow with the cooperation of the United States in April 2002.
Alex, where do you come out on this? Because, again, he didn't threaten the United States. As a matter of fact, the United States imports a lot of oil.
No, that's right. Well, he didn't directly threaten the United States, but I think he was seen as very threatening to the agenda of the United States in Latin America. And as George was pointing out earlier, neoliberalism had spread throughout the region. Neoliberalism being, of course, the reduction of the state to its utmost minimum, and privatization of all sorts of social services, the lowering of trade tariffs, so on and so forth, just to profit, really, international corporations, international financial entities, and so on. This had a devastating effect on Latin America. The rate of poverty went up. The rate of inequality went up throughout the region, particularly in Venezuela. In Venezuela, there was a big anti-neoliberal protest, really, that resulted in the end in a massacre of thousands of people perpetrated by the Venezuelan government. So a resistance was beginning to emerge, but it was really just in the streets. And Chavez, when he came into power, he gave voice to this resistance, and he actively actually fought the neoliberal agenda. He started to roll back these reforms and to bring the state back into the picture in terms of bringing basic social services, healthcare and education, and so on to the people. And so this was an example, of course, that the U.S. was very much opposed to. They didn't want to see it spread. So they were very intent in getting rid of this government. They supported a coup in April of 2002 against Chavez. And fortunately, that coup unraveled quickly. There were divisions within the military, and also many of the Venezuelan people came into the street and called for Chavez to return. He came back within 48 hours. And then following that, other left-leaning governments, very much against the neoliberal agenda, also emerged throughout Latin America. And today, the map of Latin America is very different politically. It's a very different place.
George, do you think that's because of Chavez in many ways?
I mean, it's undeniable that Chavez has played a powerful role in this, but in reality, I like to refer to Chavez as more an expression of these revolutionary movements and sort of a point of coalescence and condensation of these popular demands, because the reality is, as I've said, they preceded Chavez, and one of the primary aspects of this was, as Alex has mentioned, opposition to neoliberalism. But even before that, in Venezuela, there was a struggle over what democracy meant. Since 1958, Venezuela was under what had been understood as a very exceptional and stable form of democracy, and yet what this was a very buffered form of representative democracy in which the people really had very little say. It was a two-party system that institutionalized all popular dissent. And so what you had was a gradual increase of dissent and the inability to express that within a political system. So one of the fundamental aspects of what exploded in the late 1980s and early 1990s and what led to Chavez's coming to power was the demand for a different different kind of democracy. And I think this is where you get into some of the some of the difficulties that our previous guest had been discussing with the new constitution, because what you have is really a contradiction and a conflict between two forms of democracy. And occasionally it takes some kind of bully pulpit in the figure of Chavez to break down the barriers of an old existing form and to allow the new sort of more participatory form to break through. And that's really what has led to this sort of almost paradoxical relationship between Chavez and the social movements, in which he seems like an authoritarian to many outside of Venezuela, and yet what he's doing is to aid and facilitate, for the most part, profoundly democratic developments within the country.
Alex, do you think the revolution will continue with his passage? Did he set a solid enough foundation?
Oh, undeniably, there's a very solid foundation now. It's, of course, been 14
So the next guy is
years
going to get
since
the
Chavez
wrath of
was elected.
Washington. The next guy will get the wrath of Washington as well.
Well, most likely, but Washington does have to come to terms with the new reality in Latin America. It's no longer the reality of the late 90s when Venezuela was an outlier. It's now a region that's changed completely. I mean, South America, most of the governments there were very close to the Venezuelan government, and even the right-wing governments were. It's very interesting to see the sort of homages, the eulogies of Chavez's legacy that are coming from all over the place in Latin America. I mean, today, of course, there was a beautiful op-ed in the New York Times written by Lula da Silva, the former president of Brazil, but you also have eulogies that are coming from the right-wing governments of Chile and Colombia. They recognize Chavez's legacy not only at home in Venezuela, but in terms of transforming the region, in terms of being a leader who has fought effectively for regional integration. And so now it's a much more independent place than it was some 10 years ago.
George, do you think the U.S. will try to turn back the clock? I mean, Chavez has made an impact.
Certainly, it would be very difficult for them to turn back the clock, but at the same time, the U.S. government has not done much to change relationships with Venezuela. You know, you could have said in 2008 when Obama came to power that you could have expected some kind of improvement in relations, and simply that didn't happen because the continuing orientation, especially with someone like Hillary Clinton as Secretary of State, the orientation was toward getting rid of Chavez as quickly as possible, and any strategy really was open, and the reality was only that the coup strategy had failed in the past, and so the strategy now under Obama has been to fund, actually with increasingly large amounts of money, the Venezuelan opposition, to fund them openly and to hope that they would defeat Chavez in an election, which they still could not manage to do despite the money flowing in from Washington. And so no, I'm sure that's the Obama administration's continuing orientation, is that now with Chavez gone, we can deal with this question electorally. But until, as Alex said, until the U.S. government recognizes the ability of the Venezuelan people to govern themselves and to decide on their own leaders, to develop their own form of democracy and to practice it, and to not impose a specific form of democracy, and certainly not to impose economic demands on Venezuelans that are unjust. Until that happens, there's really no way for these relations to improve.
You know, Alex, the world loved Chavez. Okay, is it because he stood up to the United States?
Yeah, no, and I'm glad you mentioned that, because yes, the world loves Chavez, but you get the impression in the U.S. and certainly looking at the U.S. Media on Venezuela that he was a very isolated, crazy, ranting, sort of buffoon-like figure. And of course, he's been reduced to this caricature in the media here. But I think throughout the world, the message has gone through. He defied the U.S. very openly. He defied them on their foreign policy. He, after 9/11, said you cannot fight terrorism with terrorism when Afghanistan was bombed. That was a very courageous and extremely isolated thing. But he's created a political space for people to, fearlessly contest the U.S. hegemony throughout the world, and U.S. Foreign policy goals, in particular U.S. intervention, and the fact that he stood up, a bit of a David to a Goliath, and survived, weathered all this time, despite so many attempts from the U.S. To destabilize that government. It's really quite heroic.
Well, George and Alex, you have diverse opinions from the mainstream. And what is the mainstream telling Americans about Chavez and his passage? A good thing? George?
I mean, the response in the mainstream media, I admit to possibly being naive and maybe expecting something a little more balanced than what was received, but the response from the mainstream media has been astounding. It has been revolting in many ways. It ranges from outright celebrations of Chavez's death, not only from the media, but also from members of Congress in the United States, to the sort of liberal line, which is essentially Chavez was crazy, and here are some crying Venezuelans, and we're going to interpret this as something that we want to, as we want to see it. For example, I saw that Rory Carroll, who writes some astoundingly ridiculous things in The Guardian, was tweeting today about how Venezuelans at the procession today in Caracas were professing a faith in religious resurrection when they were saying Chavez lives forever, when in reality what Venezuelans are saying is that this struggle will continue and will go on without him, and that they are all Chavez. But this is the sort of willful misinterpretation that is prevalent in the mainstream media these days.
Alex, was Chavez a revolutionary? Last 30 seconds.
Oh, undeniably, yes. In the tradition of the great revolutionaries of Latin America, Simón Bolívar, José Martí, the Che Guevara, he's going to be greatly missed, but his example is really stronger than ever. I think he really lives on in the hearts of many Latin Americans that seek much more profound change throughout the region.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. We've run out of time. Many thanks to my guests today in Philadelphia, London, and in Washington. And thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time, and remember, crosstalk rules.
I love it. And he's trying.